BA from Hardin-Simmons University in 1964, before completing a PhD in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin in 1971. He has since received honorary doctorates from the University of Cologne in Germany and Soka University in Tokyo, Japan. Dr. Hickman's work as an ambassador for the Center has taken him to 18 countries and contributed to the global renaissance of Dewey studies. In addition to having served as president of the John Dewey Society, Dr. Hickman has served as the president of the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, the Society for Philosophy and Technology, and the Southwestern Philosophical Society. In 2012, Dr. Hickman was awarded the John Dewey Society's Career Achievement Award, along with his friend and former colleague, Dr. Joanne Boydston. More recently, Dr. Hickman received the Herbert W. Schneider Career Achievement Award from the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy. Dr. Hickman has held academic appointments at the University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M University, as well as visiting appointments and positions in Germany, Spain, and the Czech Republic. For the past 20 years, Dr. Hickman has been the director of the Center for Dewey Studies and a professor of philosophy at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, where he teaches courses in the philosophy of technology, classical American philosophy, and the philosophy of education. Dr. Hickman has published books and essays on a variety of topics, including American philosophy, the philosophy of technology, film studies, gay rights, and the history of logic. His books are many, but several that perhaps stand out include Pragmatism as Postmodernism in 2007, Philosophical Tools for Technological Culture, and Pragmatism to Work in 2001, and John Dewey's Pragmatic Technology in 1990, which received the Outstanding Academic Book Award from Choice. Dr. Hickman has recently been working with Jim Garrison and Daisuke Ikeda at the Ikeda Center for Peace, Learning, and Dialogue. Their dialogues have inspired the book Living is Learning, John Dewey in the 21st Century, published in 2014 by Pat Press. Dr. Hickman's partner on this project, Jim Garrison, wrote to me that, like many, I owe Larry a substantial scholarly debt. It has been my considerable fortune over the years to incur much of that debt in valuable face-to-face conversations. I cannot close without noting in my own interactions with Dr. Hickman, I found him to be extremely approachable, supportive, and generous. I was able to attend the 2012 Dewey in Mexico conference with him, and I can tell you that in addition to his many other areas of expertise, Dr. Hickman is also well-versed in the art of tequila. It is therefore my pleasure to welcome the 2015 John Dewey Society Annual Lecturer, Dr. Larry Hickman.
Give me a minute here to get my slides up. I do have a few.
I'm waiting if anybody does want one of my books. Raise your hand. I'll make you play. And like John Dewey, I get fired everywhere. I have a movie they made. See, me being fired. Anybody want that? Illegal copy. Be careful, man.
Thanks, Dennis, for that presentation. You're a hard act to follow, by the way. Well, let me begin by thanking the Society's officers, Kathleen Dabowitz, Glenn Wax, Darren Boyles, Kyle Greenwald, Mark Kissel, and of course Matt Rigg and Zane Lubena, the webmaster. And I know just exactly how much effort goes into the work of this society. As a part of my preparation for this annual John Dewey lecture, I visited the Society's website to review the list of former presenters in 1958. It's a very distinguished list, and I may say sufficiently distinguished to make this year's presenter doubly honored by the invitation. Now, I told Kathleen that given my topic, I'd probably walk into the target on my back since there are four things that Americans prefer not to talk about in polite conversation: religion, politics, personal bank accounts, and I'm sure you can guess what the other one is. In 1955, let's see, let me go on to slide 2 here. I'm not doing a handout, so I'm going to put a lot of what I'm saying up here so that you can see it as well as hear it. In 1955, when Will Herbert published his influential book, Protestant Catholic Jew, it could be said with some confidence that an essay on American religious sociology could claim exclusive coverage by restricting its analysis to those three faiths. Scarcely a decade later, however, that formula would become obsolescent. The 1960s saw the rise of what Jose Casanova, and Thomas Hickman termed religions of self-expression and self-realization, along with the triumph of the therapeutic. 30 years further on, the 1990s gave us pastoral care of the soul as big business and rejection of organized religion in favor of ecumenical spirituality. Americans were offered a new category, spiritual but not religious. Since that time, the religious profile of America, however simple, has become even more complex. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life reports that more than a quarter, 28% of American adults, have left the faith in which they were raised in favor of another religion or no religion at all. If change in affiliation from one type of Protestantism to another is included, roughly 44% of adults have either switched religious affiliation, moved from being unaffiliated with any religion to being affiliated with a particular faith, or dropped any connection to a specific religious tradition altogether. In its 2012 survey, Pew reports that some 19% of Americans claim no religious affiliation. And among those who describe themselves as politically liberal, that figures in the neighborhood of 40%, and trending upward. Further, among Americans ages 18 to 29, 1 in 4 say that they are not currently affiliated with any particular religion. This complex picture, coupled with the fact that our students may also bring their religious backgrounds as Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, or Wiccans to our classrooms, this provokes a consideration of my topic, that is, what we can teach when we teach about religion. Now, given the dogmatism and exclusivity of some contemporary forms of religious belief, for example, how can the religious experiences of our students be liberated so they can travel along broader avenues? Given the fact that we're now living in what is increasingly a culturally rich and highly pluralistic society, how can we help our students assess whether some forms of religious belief are better adapted than others to these new circumstances? Is it possible for us and our fellow Americans, despite our many individual and cultural differences, to share a common faith? If so, what form would that faith take? And how can we help our students develop the tools they will need to think critically about these questions, which are all the more difficult because they are both intensely personal and profoundly public? More specifically, I wanted to focus on these questions with three different groups of students, three very different groups of students in mind. Although these groups are not exhaustive, they do tend to cut across religious and non-religious affiliations that are reflected in the Pew studies. The first group includes those who share beliefs of dogmatic and exclusivist religious communities. The second group includes those who share the beliefs that now there is only deferral and difference, that commonality among humans is elusive, and that legitimate value judgments about religious faith and practice are elusive. The third group includes those who feel that because they are not affiliated with any religious community, they are therefore excluded from the possibility of religious faith. It is important to note that the issue I'm addressing is closely related to, but significantly distinct from, controversies regarding how the Bible can be taught in public schools. Nevertheless, in their excellent empirical study of that issue for the civic good, the liberal case for teaching religion in public schools, Walter Feinberg legitimacy from educational legitimacy. As to the former, constitutional legitimacy, they cite the influential Supreme Court decision in the case of Lemon versus Kurtzman, 1971, regarding the constitutionality of government legislation in the sphere of religion. Chief Justice Warren Burger delineated the following three-part test. First, the statute must have a secular legislative purpose. Second, its principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. And finally, the statute must not foster excessive entanglement with religion. If constitutional legitimacy tends to be restricted with respect to government, then educational legitimacy can be understood as expansive with respect to the teacher. Feinberg and Layton offer three criteria of educational legitimacy. First, there should be respect based on the obligation of teachers to students. Second, there should be inclusiveness based on the obligation of teachers to a democratic public. And third, there should be academic integrity based on the obligation of teachers to their subject matter. These are important considerations that provide a background for thinking about what we can teach when we teach about religion. More specific to my topic, however, I believe that one of the ways we can begin to address the needs of students of the three types that I've mentioned is by helping them to understand that evolution, including the evolution of religious beliefs and institutions, is a reality that they do well to take into account if they are to understand the milieu historically and culturally and socially in which they live. Of course, I do not need to remind this audience that the question of how or indeed whether evolution is to be taught in the public schools, colleges, and universities is itself often a subject of contention. In a recent interview, for example, the governor of Wisconsin appeared to be confused about that very issue. But since that discussion is outside the scope of what I want to talk about today, I hope that you'll simply allow me to stipulate that as teachers we have obligations to educate our students about evolution as fact and theory, whenever the topic is appropriate to our subject matter. In their excellent essay, Addressing Controversies in Science and Education, A Pragmatic Approach to Evolution in Education, this appeared in Science Education in 2008, David Hildebrand, Kimberly Licka, and John Katz provide an excellent discussion of this issue that is rich in themes that will be familiar to members of this society, and so I'm very pleased to recommend that essay to you. So as we think about what we can teach when we teach about religion, it is important that we emphasize the fact that evolution itself evolves. That is, that what we understand by the evolution of beliefs and practices itself undergoes continual change. Education about religion means that we must encourage our students to reject absolutist facades that deny progress through time, to reject the urge to take refuge in vague varieties of relativism, and also to reject the possibility that religious experience is something that is no longer possible for educated men and women. Honesty demands that we not blink at the fact that if our students are to understand their place in our rapidly changing world, then it is inevitable that some systems of religious belief be understood as more evolved than others. By this, I mean that some are better adapted than others to the demands of life in our rapidly changing environment. There are many productive ways to address this issue in our classrooms. One way is to start from historical accounts and taxonomies. Robert Bellow, for instance, has proposed that we think historically. He offers 5 stages. The primitive, let's go back. He offers 5 stages. 1, the primitive aboriginal stage. 2, the archaic stage of ancient Greece. 3, the historical stage of Roman Catholicism. 4, the early modern stage of Protestantism. And 5, the modern stage of meditative and integrated religions. Even given its apparent Eurocentric bias, however, this schema can serve as a tool for opening up fruitful classroom discussions, since it opens the door in stage 5 for consideration of non-Western religions such as Buddhism. Other taxonomies track progress from less to more evolved forms of ontological commitments, organizational structures, commitment to ecumenical values, and so on. The use of these historical accounts and taxonomies in no way commits us to either rigid hierarchies or to a lazy ecumenism that attempts to prop itself up on an everything is of equal value reading of important studies in comparative religion. Properly employed, these taxonomies can stimulate rich, productive discussions about the relative value of various forms of religious expression within the context of the problems and prospects that our students face. It is also important to remind our students that just as it is often the case with biological evolution, newer forms of religious expression and institutions are not by that very fact more evolved. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, God, a Biography, this is one of my favorite books of this period. I bought several copies to give out. I loved it so much. In this book, God, a Biography, for example, Jack Miles suggested that the idea we find in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the books of Genesis and Job, the idea that one can argue with God, and in the case of Job, that one can even take the moral high ground, that this idea is much more richly involved than some aspects of the via negativa of medieval Latin Christianity. In terms of my wider point, however, the via negativa constituted a move in theology from process to stasis, whereas we know that evolutionary thinking has generally moved in the opposite direction, from fixed species to models that take process into account. It would, however, be a mistake at this point to praise Judaism over Christianity in general. That would not be possible in any event, given the fact that the terms Judaism and Christianity designate a wide range of beliefs within their respective communities. The point instead would be to initiate a discussion of the relative role of human agency and competing concepts of the self within the various strands of the two religious traditions. Good pedagogy dictates that we be able to assess the ways that religious institutions accommodate themselves to existing environments, as well as the ways they seek to alter those environments. To claim that we cannot follow these changes through time, to claim that we cannot assess their value with respect to certain universalizable values such as tolerance, charity, promotion of emotional well-being, and the growth of individuals and communities, would be to block the way to inquiry. It would strike at the heart of the educational process itself. The corollary of this point is that not all existing contexts of religious belief and practices are created equal. It is undeniable, for example, that we are now experiencing a strong pull of globalizing tendencies. During the coming decades, we'll be living with ever more intimately with peoples and institutions that are quite different from us and our own. It behooves us and our students, therefore, to find successful ways of doing so. Measured against this larger global cultural context, then, it makes no sense at all to say that the local cultural context of the caste system that supports the strand of Hinduism that defends the abuse of the Dalits is as evolved as the democratic cultural context that supports those strands of value-creating Buddhism that promote equality across lines of class, relative affluence, gender, and sexual orientation. About such matters, we must be clear. We must be clear for all of our students, regardless of whether they attempt to retreat behind exclusivist religious dogma or assert with the confidence of privilege that no particular vantage point is privileged, or whether they think that the possibility of religious faith is closed to them because of their lack of institutional affiliation. Now, there will inevitably be members of exclusivist religious groups who will object that any educator who follows the path I've just described, who practices what we might call a pragmatic pedagogy with respect to religion, will be guilty You probably have too, and you probably know this is how it runs. First premise, the critical pragmatic pedagogy of religion of the type I'm describing is a form of secular humanism. Second premise, secular humanism is religion by another name. Conclusion, it must therefore follow that to advance critical pragmatic pedagogy of religion is to proselytize for one particular religion at the expense of others. Now, there are several ways to respond to this type of argument. First, there is the law. As Feinberg and Layton pointed out, quote, the courts have affirmed that exposure of students to ideas and values that may be at odds with their own firmly held religious beliefs does not constitute disapproval of religion or establishment of an alleged religious perspective such as secular humanism. Second, it is easy enough to draw a bright line of sharp distinction between proselytizing on one side and free and open inquiry on the other. Generally speaking, proselytizing tends to occur in context or settings that may be regarded as inappropriate. It tends to be insensitive to cultural and individual backgrounds. It begins and ends with positions that are intransigent and dogmatic, and it often involves behavior that is aggressive. The pragmatic pedagogy that I'm describing takes pains to develop appropriate context for discussion. It insists that all parties be sensitive to the cultural and individual backgrounds of all discussants. It ensures that discussions remain non-dogmatic and open to new ideas. It avoids aggressive behavior by carefully managing discussions in ways that maximize respect. Whether we call this type of pedagogy pragmatic or not is of little importance. It can have various names. It draws on the discourse ethics advanced by Jürgen Habermas as a basis for democratic life. It resonates with what Richard Bernstein has termed democratic ethos, in which engaged pluralism is at once agonistic and discursive, in which, and this is extremely important, in which consensus is neither a presupposition nor a goal, in which the most diverse perspectives are welcomed, and in which there is a genuine willingness to listen, to really listen, and to hear what others are saying, to use one's imagination to understand what may initially strike one as alien and even repugnant. We may wish to call this type of education critical, or humanist, or liberal, or democratic, or something similar. I've chosen to call it pragmatic because of its intimate connection to the work of John Dewey. But I believe that each of these names is appropriate to an educational practice that sets out the terms and conditions for unhindered discussions that include respect, tolerance, civility, open minds, generosity of spirit, and fair treatment across lines of gender, class, race, and sexual orientation. I submit that attacks on educational practice of this type are not simply attacks on democratic processes. They are also attacks on the experimental methods of the physical and social sciences. For pragmatic educational practices advances arm in arm with the methods of the sciences. Once we begin to assess religious beliefs and practices in terms of their functional roles within cultural contexts, the implications tend to penetrate deeply into economic issues such as the feminization of poverty, public health issues, and issues that involve environmental sustainability. These are areas in which there are reliable, experimentally obtained data that allow us to transcend dogma and that provide the basis for intelligent, informed classroom discussions of religious belief and practice. It's also important to remind ourselves that just as is the case with biological evolution, older and newer institutional forms often exist side by side, even within religious communities that share the same name. Examples are plentiful. In terms of gender issues, public health, and economic development, the fundamentalist Islam of the tribal regions of Pakistan can only be regarded as atavistic when compared to the religious pluralism of more moderate and more advanced forms of Islam, such as those practiced by the Turkish Sufis. To take another example, in certain parts of Southeast Asia, despite the crystal clear message of the Buddha regarding idolatry, there are still religious people who claim to follow the teachings of the Shakyamuni, but continue to live in a world populated by invisible spirits that must be placated, that constitute a drag on economic development, and that are the occasion in some countries for ethnic strife. The point that can be drawn from the discussion so far, I hope, is the salutary effect of a pragmatic approach to educating about religion that stresses the developmental trends in religious beliefs and institutions, all the while avoiding hard and fast taxonomies. My suggestions here follow the footsteps of John Dewey and William James. I'm suggesting that we can teach our students that when religion is understood as a function of human life rather than as a set of ontological or ideological commitments, they will be more likely to understand their own beliefs and practices as well as those of their fellow citizens half the world away, and consequently more capable of making informed decisions about their own religious commitments or absences thereof. I call this pragmatic pedagogy because I'm suggesting that we encourage our students to look at what particular religious expression does, how it functions in the realms of ethics, aesthetics, politics, and the technical sciences. For example, and this from the perspective of a world that is shrinking day by day as its networks of communication become more extensive and complex. I'm suggesting that we encourage our students to consider how forms of this expression function in their local environments, as well as within the broader context of the forces that have propelled globalization in terms of universalized values that have been developed over time, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Citizens of our community, world community, will have many opportunities and indeed many incentives to tailor their religious beliefs and institute to their own needs and interests, rather than to automatically accepting those of the communities in which they have been born and have been nurtured. Results of the Pew survey cited at the beginning of the presentation surely supports this claim. I'm convinced that the pragmatism of John Dewey, William James, was to develop pedagogy to challenge this situation, even though their accounts were in many important respects. For which religious belief is universal. Religious belief is ultimately his new edge against nihilism. A particular form of religious belief takes is for him ultimately a matter of cultural background and personal temperament. The impulse to religion, he suggested, comes from what he termed more, that is on limits of conscious experience and most likely on of the subconscious. He wrote that it involves some part of the self, unmanifested, and always some power of organic expression in abeyance or service. That's from the writer's religious experience. The more is a subconscious continuation of our conscious life. Then, end quote, then what can only be described as death to move, he added that invades, end quote, from the subconscious realm tends to take on objective appearances, to give rise to feelings that something outside the organ, perhaps even some personality, is in control of the larger situation, if not destiny itself. Why is this a death to move? It's of course the fact that James is at once laying the groundwork for two essential pragmatic pedagogy of religious experience. First, he is raising the possibility of a naturalized religious experience that can be understood as a part of a psychological experience, and that is therefore of universal import above that creed. Of course, this is so important for that third group of students that I mentioned. But second, and perhaps more important, he's also providing potential cover for the plethora of religious assumed differences in culture and temperament. He accomplished this second move by introducing the concept of over-beliefs. Here, he writes, in one of my favorite passages in all of the James, here he writes, the prophets of all different religions, some of their voices, raptures, and other openings, supposed by each to authenticate its own particular faith. So here it is, the temporal cultural background foregrounded, generate vast arrays of belief systems and institutions that ride forth the stride universal psychological more. Yet from one end, looked at one end, we can see that James detects a sensibility the world. But this common sensibility has many more expression. Looked at from the other end, expressions, though richly variegated, are rooted in experiences that are untold, simply because of the way in which we have evolved and experienced our environment conditions, including the literature. By making these moves, James's implicit claim was that spirituality be understood in naturalistic terms as a common feature of human life. But has he not thereby opened the door to natural, which is a non-supernatural religion? Has he not opened the door to religious expressions that are misrecorded in their outcome? Has he opened the door to possibilities of religious belief on the part of those who feel themselves excluded from that possibility? Has he not indicated how a bridge of understanding can be constructed between those of our students who live exclusives, those whose commitment is relativism of deferral difference, and even those who feel themselves excluded from religious belief because of lack of institutional action? In fact, as postscript to the writers, and it does, in fact, open the door to a type of experience that is at once naturalistic, humanist, and ethical. Practical means, he says, of experiences in religion seem to be sufficiently met by belief that beyond each man and woman, in a fashion continuous with him or her, exists a larger power which is to him and to his or her ideals. All that the facts report is that the power should be both other and larger than conscious selves. And larger too, if it only be large enough to trust for the next step. Why, he asked, may not the world of the Republic banquet, where all the quality respect others' personal sacredness, yet sit at the table of space and time? This is probably one of the most elements of the way that supernatural and naturalist religious views can go on that I've read any time. Why, he asked, may not the world be a sort of Republican banquet, where all the qualities of being respect one another's personal sacredness, you sit at the table of space and time? But if she's barely open to humanism that is capable of service to common faith, then John eagerly flung that door wide open and stepped through it. His little book on faith, which I'm sure many of all of you well, for example, might even be read as a reply to James. This is central argument is simple enough, and doubtless familiar to all of you here. I want to read it again because of its importance in the context of saying. It's highly relevant to our globalizing circumstances. He reminds us that there is no such thing as religion. There is no single unique property that all religions have. Given the plethora of possibilities, Dewey suggests a person cannot choose religion in a generic sense. Religion in its generic sense does not exist. To choose a religion is to choose a particular outlook on life, a particular set of ideals. Moreover, even if someone remains within the religious community into which he or she was born and nurtured, that does constitute choice. Now, Dewey's solution problem of choosing from among the world's many religions, or else in terms with the fact that none of them is adequate to one's needs, was to propose a common faith.